Welcome back, my dear friend. Let everything slow. There is a world that held for 10,000 years, a world positioned at the narrowest point between the Eye of Terror and the rest of the galaxy, the Cadian Gate, the corridor through which every Black Crusade had to pass if it intended to reach the heart of the Imperium. A world whose people were born soldiers, whose children could recite military formations before they could read, whose entire civilization had been built around a single purpose: hold. Cadia held for 10,000 years across 12 Black Crusades against the most sustained offensive pressure that Chaos had ever directed at a single world. Cadia held. The Cadian shock troopers became the Imperium's benchmark for military excellence. The fortress world became the model for what a defended position could be. The people who lived there understood from birth that they existed on the edge of the abyss, that the Eye of Terror was visible in the sky above them as a constant smear of color that should not exist, and that the distance between the galaxy's inhabited worlds and total consumption was measured in their willingness to stand. And then, in 999 M41, the last year of the 41st millennium, it fell. Tonight we begin at the beginning, before the fall, with Cadia as it had existed for 10,000 years. What it was, what the pylons were, why the Cadian Gate mattered, and what Abaddon had been building toward across 12 failed crusades. What Cadia was: a fortress world. The category is common enough in the Imperium's geography of war. Worlds whose primary function was military, whose population existed to produce soldiers and maintain defenses. But Cadia was the fortress world above all others, the one whose position made its function existential rather than simply strategic. The Cadian Gate was the narrow astronomical corridor between the Eye of Terror's edge and the systems of the Segmentum Obscurus. On either side of the gate, the Eye's influence made stable warp travel effectively impossible. Ships attempting to navigate around Cadia rather than through the gate faced the roiling instability of the Eye's margins. The gate was the path. Cadia was what stood in the path. Every Black Crusade since the first had come through the Cadian Gate. Abaddon's forces and the demon armies that poured out of the Eye when the gate cracked open enough to let them through had no other viable approach to the Imperium's interior. The gate was the bottleneck, and Cadia was the cork. The world itself was extraordinary in its defense infrastructure. Castles, fortress cities, their walls meters thick, built to take and hold ground against assault from any direction. The underground tunnel networks that connected the castles, allowing troops to move between positions even when the surface was under fire. The orbital platforms, the void shields, the layered defensive systems that 10,000 years of refinement and the accumulated knowledge of 12 Black Crusades had produced. The Cadian people were the world's deepest investment. Born into a military culture so total that civilian life barely had a separate identity. Trained from childhood, psychologically and culturally shaped around warfare in the way that other civilizations were shaped around trade or religion. The Kasrkin, the Cadian equivalent of elite troops, were the best soldiers the Imperial Guard produced. The ordinary shock troopers were better than most other worlds' finest. They had stood against Chaos 12 times. Each time, the Black Crusade had eventually been pushed back or had simply exhausted itself against the defenses. Cadia remained. The people understood what they were for. The world understood what it was for. For 10,000 years, the understanding had been sufficient. What the pylons were. The Cadian pylons were the world's oldest secret and its most important one. Over 5,000 of them, standing 500 meters above Cadia's surface and descending 250 meters below it. Enormous monolithic structures of Blackstone, a material that the Adeptus Mechanicus had never been able to fully analyze or replicate. They were Necron in origin, built millions of years ago by a civilization that predated humanity's existence on Terra, serving a function that only a handful of people in the Imperium understood even at the height of the 41st millennium. The pylons suppressed the warp. More precisely, they created a field that restricted the Eye of Terror's natural tendency to expand. Without them, the Eye would have grown across the Cadian Gate and absorbed the world. The Eye had been expanding slowly since the Horus Heresy, when Chaos had poured so much psychic energy into the creation of the Chaos Gods, and the deaths of billions that the warp had begun bleeding into reality more intensely. The pylons held that bleeding at bay. Each Black Crusade had destroyed some pylons. This was, in retrospect, the pattern that those who understood the pylons' function had identified as the most alarming aspect of Abaddon's campaigns. He was not simply trying to conquer Cadia. He was systematically reducing the number of pylons that prevented the Eye from expanding. Each crusade that seemed like a failure was also a partial success in the metric that mattered most. The pylon's true function was known to the Adeptus Mechanicus's most senior archmagos, to elements of the Inquisition, to the Necron lords who had built them. It was not widely known. The people of Cadia, who stood on the surface next to these enormous structures, understood them as ancient architecture of uncertain purpose. They had been there longer than the Imperium. They were clearly important in some undefined way, and they were things to defend because Cadia defended everything. Belisarius Cawl, the Archmagos Dominus, whose projects had been running for 10,000 years under the Emperor's original commission, knew more about the pylons than almost anyone. He had been studying them. He had been developing a way to use them. The understanding he had reached, that the pylons could be amplified, that their field could be extended and strengthened, was the information that would eventually define the 13th Black Crusade's most critical tactical dimension: the Eye of Terror and its pressure. The Eye of Terror was the warp rift that had existed since the fall of the Eldar, when an ancient civilization's decadence and excess had torn open the fabric of reality and birthed Slaanesh. It was the largest permanent warp rift in the galaxy, a region where the boundary between real space and the immaterium had broken down so completely that the two existed simultaneously in the same space. Inside the Eye, the Chaos Space Marines had made their homes for 10,000 years. The traitor legions that had followed Horus into rebellion against the Emperor had retreated into the Eye after the heresy's failure, and the Eye's warped time and shifting reality had preserved them in various states of enhancement and mutation. Demon worlds and fortress worlds and the estates of Chaos champions occupied the Eye's interior. The armies that poured out through the Cadian Gate during each Black Crusade were drawn from this reserve, vast forces built over 10 millennia, sustained by the Chaos powers, ready to be unleashed whenever Abaddon judged the moment right. The Eye's pressure on the Cadian Gate had been increasing across the 41st millennium. As the pylons were reduced, and as the psychic weight of the galaxy's wars accumulated in the warp, the Eye pushed harder against its boundaries. The warp storms that had disrupted travel across the Segmentum Obscurus in the centuries before the 13th Crusade were symptoms of this pressure. The Eye was not simply existing in its boundaries, it was actively pressing against them. By 999 M41, the pressure was at a level that the remaining pylons were straining to contain. Cowl's analysis of the situation was grim. Without intervention, the Eye would eventually overwhelm the pylon's capacity. and expand naturally. The 13th Black Crusade's timing was not arbitrary. Abaddon had calculated that the pylons were sufficiently reduced and the eye sufficiently pressurized that this was the moment when the gate could be broken permanently. Abaddon's 12 Crusades. Abaddon the Despoiler, the War Master of Chaos. The title Horus had held, taken by the champion who had succeeded to the role of the Chaos Power's primary instrument against the Imperium. He had launched 12 Black Crusades from the Eye of Terror across 10,000 years, each one a massive military operation that the Imperium had eventually beaten back at enormous cost. The conventional reading of this history, that the Black Crusades had failed, and that Abaddon was therefore a symbol of Chaos's inability to overcome the Imperium's defenses, was wrong in the way that assessments made without full information are often wrong. The Black Crusades had not been purely military operations. They had been pylon reduction campaigns, disguised as military operations. Each crusade had destroyed pylons. Each crusade had expanded the eye slightly further. Each crusade had weakened the containment that stood between the eye and the galaxy's populated systems. The Imperium had celebrated each crusade's failure without understanding what had actually been accomplished. By the 13th Crusade, Abaddon had been reducing the pylon network for 10 millennia. He had been patient in the way that beings who serve chaos can be patient. Not because chaos values patience, but because Tzeentch's long plans and Abaddon's own capacity for strategic thinking across centuries had produced the understanding that the final blow required the preparation that 12 Crusades had been building toward. The 13th Black Crusade was going to be different. Not because Abaddon had grown stronger, though he had. Because the pylons were sufficiently reduced, the eye was sufficiently pressurized, and the plan he had developed was not simply another military assault, but a mechanism for permanent transformation of the galaxy's geography. He called it the Crimson Path. The plan to overload the remaining pylons by summoning enough demons to Cadia's surface, overwhelming the suppression field with sheer psychic mass, and let the eye expand to swallow Cadia, transforming the fortress world into a demon world and opening a permanent corridor for chaos forces to move freely through. If the Crimson Path succeeded, the Cadian Gate would be gone. The barrier would be gone. The 10,000 years of holding would end in a single campaign, and what came after would be chaos moving freely toward terror. Sleep well. 7 more parts remain, and the 13th Black Crusade is beginning. The signs came first. They always did. The galaxy telegraphing catastrophe through the instruments of lesser disasters. The warp announcing major incursions through the minor ones that preceded them. In the years before the 13th Black Crusade, the Cadian sector experienced the escalation of activity that the Imperium's long institutional memory associated with the build-up to a major assault from the eye. Space hulks, the enormous conglomerate vessels that drifted through the warp and emerged into real space unpredictably. Some boarding candidates for the Adeptus Astartes, some threats to be destroyed, all of them signs that the warp's currents were disturbed in ways that pointed towards significant activity at their source. The space hulks that emerged around the Cadian sector in the final years of M41 were more numerous than any previous build-up. The Imperium's forces boarded and destroyed what they could. What got through struck at naval bases and strategically important systems across the sector, degrading the Imperium's ability to respond to what was coming. The naval infrastructure mattered. The Cadian Gate's defense was not simply about the troops on the ground. It required the void assets that could intercept the Black Fleet before it reached orbit, that could interdict the landing forces that would follow the initial assault. that could maintain the supply lines and reinforcement routes that a sustained campaign required. The Space Hulk campaign in the years before the 13th Crusade was Abaddon dismantling the Imperium's ability to respond at the scale the coming assault would demand. Then, the Black Fleet emerged from the eye, the scale of what came. The 13th Black Crusade was, by every measure available, the largest single military operation in the 41st millennium before the Gathering Storm. Abaddon had spent 10,000 years building toward this, and the force he assembled expressed that accumulation in full. Traitor Space Marine legions, the Thousand Suns, the Death Guard, the World Eaters, the Word Bearers, the Night Lords. Fragments of the traitor legions that had fled into the Eye after the Horus heresy, spending 10 millennia in the warped time of the Eye's interior. Their numbers were not what they had been at the heresy's height. 10,000 years of warfare in the Eye's shifting reality had reduced them and changed them. But what they had lost in absolute numbers, they had gained in individual capability. These were warriors who had been fighting continuously for 10 millennia, enhanced by chaos gifts, shaped by the Eye's extreme environment into instruments of war that exceeded what any fresh recruit, even a Space Marine, could match through training alone. Chaos Space Marine warbands in enormous number. Beyond the traitor legions, the Eye of Terror had produced 10,000 years of Chaos warriors who belonged to no legion, but served Abaddon's banner when the Despoiler called. Mercenaries of Chaos, champions who had gathered their own followings, warlords whose ambitions aligned with the 13th Crusade's objectives sufficiently to commit their forces. The Black Fleet was vast. Demon armies, the warp entities who could be bound or persuaded into service. The lesser demons and the greater ones, the servants of each of the 4 chaos gods who had agreed or been compelled to participate. Demon armies fought differently from mortal armies. They could not be killed in the conventional sense, only banished back to the warp from which they would eventually re-emerge, and their battlefield effects included the psychic and reality warping capabilities that made fighting Chaos forces categorically different from fighting other mortal armies. Human followers of Chaos, the Chaos cultists, and the renegade guardsmen, and the civilian populations of worlds that had been absorbed into Chaos control across the Black Crusades. These were the numbers that made the 13th Crusade's ground forces astronomically large. Individually weaker than Space Marines or hardened Chaos veterans, collectively sufficient to overwhelm defenses through mass alone. The Crimson Path required enough warp-devoted souls on Cadia's surface to overload the pylons. The mass of the 13th Crusade was, in part, a function of this requirement. Abaddon needed enough demonic presence on Cadia to push the pylon network past its capacity, and the Crimson Path's success depended on achieving that threshold. The first wave and the response. The Black Fleet emerged from the Eye, and the Imperial forces responded with everything the Cadian sector could marshal. The Cadian armies, the shock troopers and the Kasrkin and the armoured columns that the fortress world had been producing for 10,000 years, deployed to their positions. The fortress cities activated their void shields and manned their walls. The orbital platforms engaged the incoming fleet. The response was massive, professional, and informed by 10,000 years of institutional knowledge about how to defend the Cadian Gate. It was not enough. The 13th Crusade scale exceeded what Cadia's forces could absorb alone. The Imperium called for reinforcement from across the sector and beyond. Space Marine chapters, guard regiments from neighbouring systems, void assets from as far away as the sector could reach in the time available. The reinforcements came, but the gate was under assault now, and the timeline for their arrival was constrained by the distances involved. The early phases of the campaign went as previous Black Crusades had gone. The Imperial forces falling back under pressure, ceding ground reluctantly, inflicting costs that slowed the advance but could not stop it. The Cassars held as long as they could. The orbital platforms fought until they were destroyed or fell back to positions where they could still contribute to the defense. The difference was that this time, the pressure was relentless in a way that previous crusades had not sustained. Abaddon was not launching probing attacks or establishing positions, or doing the tactical work that a campaign with future withdrawal in mind required. He was pushing. The Crimson Path required Cadia's defense to be broken before the pylons could be amplified. If the pylons were successfully activated, the demon presence would be pushed back and the eye's expansion would be contained. He had a window, and the window was defined by Call's ability to reach and operate the amplification system. Lord Castellan Creed, Ursarkar E. Creed. The Lord Castellan of Cadia, the man who had governed the fortress world's military and civil affairs through the years leading up to the 13th Crusade. He was one of the Imperium's most capable commanders, a tactician of extraordinary ability, a man who had spent his entire career on and around Cadia preparing for the event that was now happening. His most famous quality was tactical genius, the ability to position forces in ways that should not have been possible given the assets available, that appeared to violate the laws of logistics and movement, that produced outcomes so improbable that the phrase Creed's tactical genius became something approaching a running joke in the community of people who studied his campaigns. The tactical rock, the legendary moment preserved in the memes of the Warhammer community. Creed's ability to appear to have concealed an asset that was too large to conceal, to have moved something faster than anything could move, to have placed a unit where no unit could plausibly have been placed. The humor around this was affectionate acknowledgement of a commander so capable that the only way to describe his planning was to invoke the impossible. In the 13th Crusade, Creed's tactical genius was deployed against a situation that no amount of tactical excellence could fully resolve. He could maximize the utility of the forces available. He could delay the inevitable. He could identify the moments when a clever repositioning or an unexpected offensive stroke could buy time. What he could not do was manufacture the forces that the scale of the crusade demanded and that the Cadian sector's reserves did not contain. He worked with what he had. He organized the defense of the remaining Cassars with the efficiency that his career had demonstrated. He managed the integration of reinforcing forces as they arrived. He coordinated with the voices on the orbital platforms and with the void assets that were still functional. He held the situation together at the moments when it was most in danger of collapsing into uncoordinated retreat. He also had to deal with the Inquisition. The High Command Massacre. Early in the 13th Crusade, before the situation had fully developed, Cadia's existing High Command was killed in an act of treachery. The details of this are preserved in the campaign's records as a significant early crisis. The execution of treacherous slaughter against the existing command structure, attributed to Chaos agents embedded within the Imperial forces who had identified the moment of maximum disruption and acted. Creed assumed command in the aftermath. The council that would have otherwise managed Cadia's defense through the established hierarchy was gone, and the man who was already the Lord Castellan became the de facto supreme commander of Cadia's resistance. Without the institutional structure that had existed to support that role, he rebuilt it. The urgent formation of new command structures, the identification of capable officers to fill the gaps the massacre had created, the maintenance of operational continuity in the middle of an active assault. Creed managed this without the process collapsing into the confusion that losing an entire command hierarchy in the middle of an invasion should have produced. His first major act as Supreme Commander was to begin preparing for the second wave he knew was coming. The first assault had been met and was being pushed back, not defeated, but contained sufficiently that the immediate crisis had stabilized. Creed understood that the containment was temporary. He used the interval to rebuild the defenses, to integrate the reinforcements that were arriving, and to prepare for the larger assault that Abaddon would mount when the initial probe had identified the weaknesses. He was right about the second wave. It came, and the second wave was larger than the first. The arrival of the unexpected. As the 13th Crusade's pressure mounted, and the Cadian sector's own resources were proving insufficient, the Imperium called on forces from further away. Among those who responded were some whose arrival changed the character of the defense in ways that the conventional command structure had not anticipated. The Phalanx, the Imperial Fist's Star Fortress, a mobile space station of enormous scale, the battle barge that served as the chapter's mobile headquarters and that carried the accumulated heritage of Rogel Dawn's sons across the millennia. The Phalanx's arrival in the Cadian system added a void asset of a kind that the system's defenses had not previously included. A fortress in orbit, carrying a chapter of Space Marines and the weapons systems of a vessel, designed as the ultimate mobile defense platform. The arrival of Belisarius Cawl, the Archmagos Dominus, who had been studying the pylons, who had developed the amplification system, who understood what the pylons were and what they could do, came to Cadia with his Mechanicus fleet and his knowledge. Cawl's presence changed the tactical situation fundamentally. There was now someone on Cadia who understood the pylons well enough to potentially use them as the weapon they had always been capable of being. The arrival of Trazyn the Infinite, the Necron Lord who had been collecting significant individuals and artifacts across the galaxy for millennia, who maintained a prison dimension in which countless notable figures from history had been stored like trophies, appeared in the context of the 13th Crusade not as an enemy, but as something more complicated. Trazyn had an interest in the pylons that was connected to his own long-term perspective. He did not want the Eye of Terror to expand any more than the Imperium did. From the Necron perspective, the warp's expansion was a direct threat to the materially grounded civilization the Necrons were attempting to rebuild after their great sleep. He revealed himself to Cawl and offered cooperation. The Necron Lord who had built the pylons millions of years ago, or whose predecessors had, understood them in ways that Cawl's millennia of study had approached but not fully reached. Together, they could make the amplification system work. The council that formed around this unexpected coalition, Creed, Cawl, Trazyn, the Space Marine commanders from the Phalanx, the other reinforcing forces, was one of the most unusual command structures in the Imperium's history. The Inquisition had already recommended virus bombing Cadia to prevent its fall from being exploited by chaos. Creed had rejected this. He was working with a Necron Lord. He was building an alliance against chaos that the Imperium's theological framework would have found deeply uncomfortable under any other circumstances. Creed was not comfortable. He was effective. Abaddon's personal attention. Midway through the 13th Crusade, Abaddon identified where the Imperial command structure had concentrated and personally led an assault against it. The Council, the gathering of Creed, Cawl, Trazyn, and the other commanders at Casa Kraf, had been located by the Despoiler's intelligence network. Abaddon moved against it directly. The assault was not a conventional military operation. It was a command decapitation strike, aimed at eliminating the minds that were coordinating Cadia's defense and implementing the pylon amplification plan. Abaddon attacked in person. The War Master of Chaos, whose personal combat capability was among the highest of any being in the galaxy, carrying the talon of Horus, the claw that had slain Sanguinius, wielding the demon sword Drachnian, armored in Terminator plate, enhanced by 10,000 years of Chaos gifts, led the assault on the Imperial command position. The Space Wolves were there. The Grey Knights were there. The forces defending the command position fought with everything they had against the War Master and his elite guards. They held him off, barely and at enormous cost, but they held him long enough for reinforcing forces from the Phalanx to arrive and force Abaddon's teleportation away. The command structure survived. Call's plan survived. The pylon amplification was still possible. Abaddon had failed to kill the Council. He had identified that the pylon amplification was the existential threat to the Crimson Path, and he had not been able to stop it through direct action. He shifted to a different approach. The Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity, the ancient vessel that had been one of the 13th Crusade's most powerful void assets, a structure whose Blackstone composition gave it properties that conventional warship weapons struggled to address, was already damaged from its engagement with the Phalanx. The Phalanx's assault had left it crippled, no longer functional as a weapon platform in the conventional sense. Abaddon pointed it at Cadia anyway. Sleep well. 6 more parts remain, and the Blackstone Fortress is already moving. A Blackstone Fortress was the most powerful weapon Chaos had deployed in the 13th Black Crusade, and possibly the most powerful weapon Chaos had deployed in any of the 12 that came before it. The Will of Eternity, the designation given to the fortress that had been part of the Black Fleet's void assets since before the 13th Crusade began, was a structure of Blackstone, the same material that composed the Cadian pylons, built by ancient forces in an era before the Imperium and before the Eye of Terror itself. Blackstone responded to psychic energy. In the hands of the Chaos forces who had found and repurposed the Blackstone fortresses scattered across the galaxy, this responsiveness had been turned into a weapon. The fortresses could concentrate and fire psychic energy at a scale that conventional void weapons could not match. Against the Phalanx, the Will of Eternity had proven itself a threat worth taking seriously. The Imperial Fist's Star Fortress had engaged it at enormous cost, damaging it severely, eventually crippling its primary weapon systems and its ability to function as an offensive void asset. But crippled and used as a weapon were not the same thing when Abaddon was doing the calculating. The Will of Eternity was now a mass, an enormous mass of Blackstone moving through the void on whatever momentum remained to it and whatever thrust Abaddon's forces could still provide, directed not toward a military objective, but toward a kinetic one. He pointed the fortress at Cadia and let it fall. The kinetic strike. The physics of what followed were not complicated. A structure of the Will of Eternity's mass, falling from orbit toward a planetary surface, would produce an impact of a magnitude that no defensive system on the surface could address. Void shields could deflect weapons fire. They could not deflect a moon. The orbital platforms could interdict incoming vessels. They could not interdict an object the size of a small city falling in pieces from orbit. The Imperial forces understood what was happening. The Council at Casa Kraf had the void assets to observe the Will of Eternity's trajectory. They understood, in real time, that the fortress was falling toward Cadia. They understood what the impact would do. They could not stop it. The phalanx was damaged. Whatever void assets remained in the Cadian system had been depleted by the 13th Crusade's extensive void battles. There was nothing large enough or fast enough or powerful enough to intercept the falling mass of a Blackstone fortress before it reached the surface. The evacuation began. Whatever the Council could do in the interval between the determination that the impact was coming and the impact itself, get people off the surface, preserve what could be preserved, organize the departure of forces that would be needed for whatever came after Cadia, they did. The fragments of the Will of Eternity struck Cadia's surface. The impact was massive by any measure available. The kinetic energy of the mass translated into heat, into shock waves, into the tectonically destabilizing force that the planet's geology had not been designed to absorb. Casa Kraf, the fortress city that had been the center of the campaign's defense, was devastated. Most of Cadia's defenders who had been on the surface were killed. The pylon network was destroyed. The Blackstone structures that had been holding back the Eye of Terror for 10,000 years, that had been the actual mechanism of Cadia's importance, the reason the fortress world mattered beyond its soldiers and its Khazars and its thousands of years of military tradition, was shattered by the impact. Over 5,000 pylons, each one 500 meters tall, each one 250 meters deep, each one part of the suppression field that kept the Eye contained, gone. Without the pylons, the Eye's pressure on the Cadian gate was no longer contained. The warp began to pour through. What the destruction meant. The Cadian pylons had been doing something that nothing else in the Imperium's arsenal could replicate. The Blackstone network that had been built millions of years ago by Necron civilization was not a technology that the Adeptus Mechanicus could reproduce. They had been studying it for years without being able to understand it fully, and the understanding they had reached through Call's work had been about amplifying what existed rather than creating something new. With the pylons gone, the suppression field was gone. The Eye of Terror, which had been pressing against its boundaries for 10,000 years, and which the 13th Crusade's earlier pylon destructions had been weakening, expanded. The warp poured into the space that the pylons had been protecting. Cadia itself became uninhabitable, not through the conventional devastation of the kinetic strike alone, but through the warp's consumption of what remained. Within hours of the impact, most of what had been Cadia was either physically destroyed by the tectonic instability or consumed by the immaterium. The fortress world that had stood for 10,000 years ceased to exist as a world. It became rubble, demon-haunted and warp-touched, orbiting the space that had been the Cadian Gate in the form of a debris field that would never again support the civilization that had given it meaning. The loss was total. The shock troopers who had been evacuated, whoever had made it off the surface before the impact, whoever had survived long enough to reach evacuation ships, were now a diaspora. Cadians without Cadia, carrying the identity of a world that no longer existed, the institutional memory of a military tradition whose home had been destroyed. The phrase that emerged from this became one of the 41st millennium's most enduring military aphorisms. Cadia stands. It was said first in the context of the fall, as an expression of the Cadian spirit persisting even after the world's physical destruction, as the assertion that the people were the world, and the world would continue in them. It became the rallying cry of Cadian regiments across the galaxy, the declaration that the world's fall had not ended the tradition. Cadia stood in its people. The world had fallen. Creed's fate. Lord Castellan Ursarkar E. Creed, the man who had commanded Cadia's defense through the 13th Black Crusade, who had rebuilt the command structure after the High Command massacre, who had coordinated the extraordinary coalition of Creed, Call, Trazyn, and the Space Marine forces, was present on Cadia's surface when the will of eternity fell. He survived the initial impact. He was involved in the desperate evacuation of what forces remained. He was present for the final moments of organized resistance on Cadia's surface as the planet tore itself apart and the warp consumed the ruins. And then he was taken. Trazyn the Infinite, the Necron collector who had been cooperating with the Imperial forces, who had aided Call with the pylon amplification system, who had brought the resources of his personal collection to the defense of Cadia, collected Creed. The exact manner of this is preserved in the lore without full resolution. Trazyn's method of adding significant individuals to his collection involved a form of stasis field. The person was preserved, removed from the flow of time, existing in suspension in the prison dimension that Trazyn maintained. Whether Creed consented to this, whether the Necron Lord acted unilaterally to preserve the Lord Castellan from certain death in the planet's final moments, or whether some combination of the two produced the outcome, the records are not clear. What is clear is the outcome. Creed was gone. The man who had commanded Cadia's last defense was in Trazyn's collection, suspended in the Necron's stasis field, somewhere in the preserved vault that the Infinite maintained. The Cadian forces who evacuated did so without their Lord Castellan. The diaspora of a people without a world was also a diaspora without the commander who had led their world's final fight. Whether Creed was eventually released, whether Trazyn's preservation of him was intended as a kindness or a collection decision, whether the Lord Castellan would ever again walk a battlefield as a living commander. The lore held these questions open at the time of the Fall's events. The Psykers of Cadia. Among the losses of Cadia's fall was a population whose significance was not immediately obvious to everyone involved. The Cadians produced more psychically gifted individuals per capita than almost any other human population in the Imperium. Living in the shadow of the Eye of Terror, in the presence of the warp's closest approach to inhabited space, had, across generations, selected for the kind of latent psychic potential that the Eye's proximity catalyzed. The population that had been producing the shock troopers was also quietly producing psykers in numbers that the Adeptus Astra Telepathica had been drawing on for the black ships for generations. These were not extraordinary psykers for the most part, not the librarians or the powerful sorcerers who shaped battlefields. They were the ordinary psychic population that the Imperium processed through the black ships to feed the Astronomicon, to train as astropaths and navigators and the other psychic functionaries that the Imperium's infrastructure required. The loss of Cadia's population was not simply a military loss. It was a demographic loss with psychic infrastructure implications. The warp storm that consumed Cadia also consumed the people on the surface who had not been evacuated. The psychic weight of their deaths, hundreds of millions of people consumed by the Immaterium in the hours of Cadia's destruction, contributed to the warp's energy in ways that echoed across the region long after the physical destruction was complete. The Eye's expansion. The warp did not stop at Cadia. With the pylons gone and the suppression field destroyed, the Eye of Terror's natural expansion resumed. The warp storms that had been building in the segmentum obscurus across the 41st millennium intensified. The corridor that had been the Cadian Gate was now a warp anomaly rather than a navigable passage, but the expansion was also connected to other events happening simultaneously across the galaxy. The 13th Black Crusade had not been the only catastrophe of 999 M41. The Necron Pylons, whose network extended across multiple worlds near the Eye, not just Cadia, had been systematically reduced across all 12 Black Crusades. The warp's pressure was not localized to the Cadian Gate. What happened next exceeded even the 13th Black Crusade's ambitions. The warp storms that expanded from Cadia's fall connected with warp disturbances being generated simultaneously across the galaxy. At Prospero, at Fenris, at the ultramarine system of Macraga, at dozens of other locations where simultaneous crises had been engineered or had spontaneously occurred. The Eye of Terror's expansion was the initiating event of something larger. The Cicatrix Maledictum, the Great Rift, the galaxy-spanning tear between real space and the warp that would split the Imperium in half and usher in the Dark Imperium. This was not simply the Eye of Terror expanding. It was the Eye expanding and connecting to every other major warp disturbance in the galaxy, producing a continuous tear that ran from the galactic southeast to the galactic northwest, dividing the Imperium into two halves that could no longer reliably communicate or reinforce each other. The Fall of Cadia was the largest single contributing event to the Great Rift's formation. The pylon network had been containing not just the Eye, but the general level of warp pressure across the region, and with that network gone, the accumulated pressure of 10 millennia of Black Crusades and wars and mass death found its release simultaneously. The galaxy changed in the hours after the Blackstone fortress struck Cadia's surface. What the survivors carried. The evacuation ships that left Cadia carried people who had just watched their world die. The Cadian soldiers who had been pulled from the surface. The civilian population who had reached the evacuation points. The guard regiments and space marine forces who had survived the 13th Crusade's surface campaign. All of them leaving a world that was already visibly tearing itself apart, consumed by the warp in real time as they watched from orbit. They carried the identity of a world that no longer existed. The Cadian regimental traditions, the drill formats, the tactical doctrines, the cultural practices of a military civilization that had been building its institutional knowledge for 10,000 years, were now held entirely in the people who had survived, with no physical location to anchor them. The casters were gone. The pylons were gone. The cities and the training grounds and the headquarters buildings and the statues of famous commanders, gone. What remained was the people. The soldiers who are now diaspora regiments deployed across the galaxy, carrying the name Cadian and the traditions it contained without a home to return to. The refugees who had never been soldiers, but who had lived their entire lives within the military culture that Cadia had produced, now displaced into a galaxy that had just changed catastrophically. Cadia stands. The phrase was spoken first in this context, in the immediate aftermath of the fall, by survivors who needed to assert that something had survived, that the destruction of the physical world had not destroyed what the world had meant. It was partly defiance and partly grief, and partly the statement that a people who had been born into the purpose of standing could not simply stop standing because the ground beneath them had been removed. Sleep well. 5 more parts remain, and the Great Rift has already begun to form. The Cicatrix Maledictum. The name translates from High Gothic as the Great Scar. The wound in reality itself that the events of 999 M41 and the years immediately following produced across the face of the galaxy. Not a warp storm in the conventional sense, not a localized disturbance that ships could navigate around, or that the Astronomicon could guide travelers past. a permanent structural change in the galaxy's metaphysical geography, running from the southeastern reaches of the galaxy to the northwestern reaches, splitting the Imperium of Man into two halves that the Astronomican's light could not reliably bridge. The Great Rift was the defining catastrophe of the transition from the 41st to the 42nd millennium. Every other event, Cadia's fall, the Gathering Storm, the awakening of Guilliman, the Indomitus Crusade, was defined in relation to it. The galaxy that existed after the Rift was a fundamentally different place from the galaxy that had existed before, and the change was permanent in a way that even 10,000 years of wars and Black Crusades had not been permanent. Tonight we follow the Rift, how it formed, what it was, what it meant for every faction in the galaxy, and why the fall of one world had produced a scar that ran across the entire galaxy. How the Rift formed. The Great Rift was not created by a single event. Cadia's fall was the largest single contributing factor, but the Rift's formation was the product of a convergence. Multiple simultaneous crises across the galaxy, each one weakening the boundary between real space and the warp in its region, all of them happening at the same time, in a way that produced the total effect that no single crisis could have produced alone. The Pylon network's destruction was the central mechanism. The Cadian pylons had been part of a broader network. Pylon structures existed on other worlds near the Eye of Terror, each one contributing to the suppression field that kept the warp's pressure contained. The 12 Black Crusades had reduced this network systematically over 10,000 years. Cadia's fall destroyed the network's core, but the broader collapse that followed was also a function of the accumulated damage across the previous Crusades. The simultaneous crises that fed the Rift's expansion were not accidental. The evidence preserved in the Warhammer 40,000 narrative suggests orchestration, that the catastrophes hitting multiple systems at the same time had been arranged by powers whose planning operated across centuries, and whose awareness of what was being built toward exceeded what any single faction could have calculated. Tzeentch's involvement in Prospero and in Magnus's path had been building for 10 millennia. The Chaos God's plans for Fenris had been developing simultaneously. The crises at Macraga and at other key systems were not coincidental with Cadia's fall. Whether this was a single coordinated plan by a coalition of chaos powers, or parallel plans by individual powers that happened to converge, or the unintended consequence of long-running strategies finally arriving at their endpoint simultaneously. The lore holds this in ambiguity. The outcome was not ambiguous. The warp pressure in the galaxy increased dramatically and simultaneously across multiple points. The boundary between real space and the immaterium weakened at all of them at the same moment, and the Eye of Terror's expansion connected with the disturbances produced by the other crises to form the continuous tear. The rift ran from the region of the Eye of Terror in the northwest, through the heart of the Segmentum Pacificus, through the galactic center, and into the southeastern reaches of the Segmentum Ultima. It was not uniformly present. It had areas of greater and lesser intensity, regions where the warp bled more strongly into real space, and regions where the tear was shallower. But across its length, it divided the galaxy into two navigational zones that conventional void travel could not bridge reliably. What the rift was. The rift was not simply a line on a map. It was an active presence, a region where the warp and real space overlapped, where the laws of physics as the Imperium understood them did not apply in consistent ways, where demonic activity was heightened, and where the warp's denizens could push through into real space more easily than anywhere else in the galaxy. For ships attempting to cross it, the rift was a navigation challenge of the most extreme kind. The Geller fields that protected void ships from the warp during standard warp travel were designed for the conditions of conventional warp space. They were not designed for direct immersion in a region where the warp and real space had merged. Ships that attempted to cross the rift without exceptional protection frequently did not emerge on the other side, or emerged damaged beyond repair, or emerged changed in ways that reflected the warp's influence on material objects. For populations on either side of the rift, its formation meant effective isolation. The segmentum obscurus and the segmentum solar on one side, the segmentum pacificus and the segmentum ultima on the other. The Imperium's governance structure, its military command arrangements, its supply chains and reinforcement routes. All of these had been built on the assumption that the galaxy's halves could communicate and support each other. The rift negated this assumption. The two halves were now separate strategic theaters connected by unreliable crossings, rather than a unified empire. The Immaterium's behavior near the rift was extreme. Demons could manifest more easily near the rift than anywhere else outside the Eye of Terror itself. Psychers near the rift experienced significantly elevated risk. The warp's closeness made uncontrolled manifestation more likely, made demonic possession more threatening, made the mental disciplines that psychers required to function safely harder to maintain. The populations of worlds near the rift found their psyker incidence increasing, and their ability to manage that incidence decreasing simultaneously. The Imperium Nihilus, the half of the Imperium cut off from Terra by the Great Rift, was called the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, the half that lay beyond the Astronomican's reliable light, where the signal from the Golden Throne that guided void ships through the warp could not consistently reach. The Imperium Nihilus was not uniformly dark. The Astronomican's signal was not simply on or off. It was attenuated and distorted and interrupted in ways that made navigation unreliable rather than impossible. Ships could still cross the rift, still navigate in the Nihilus, still reach Terra from the other side. The difficulty was elevated, the risk was elevated, the time required was elevated, but the Nihilus was not completely cut off. What it lost was the certainty. The Imperium had functioned for 10,000 years on the assumption that the Astronomican's light was a reliable guide, that a sufficiently skilled navigator could take a ship from any point in the Imperium to any other point in a predictable time frame. The Nihilus removed that certainty. Ships that entered the rift might arrive where they intended, or arrive late, or arrive early, or arrive in the wrong place, or not arrive at all. Planning military operations in the Nihilus required accepting a level of logistical uncertainty that the Imperium's command structures were not designed for. The worlds of the Nihilus had to become more self-reliant. Local governors, chapter masters, planetary commanders, those who had always been able to call on support from Terra or from neighboring systems found that support was no longer reliably available. The Nihilus became a collection of semi-autonomous regions, each managing its own crises with the resources available locally, coordinating with its neighbors when possible, and operating independently when not. For Chaos and Xenos forces in the Nihilus, this self-reliance imperative was an opportunity. The disrupted communications and the reduced Imperial presence in many regions created gaps in the defensive coverage that had prevented local threats from growing to existential scale. Xenos empires that had been contained by the consistent Imperial presence expanded into the gaps. Chaos incursions that would previously have been met with reinforced responses went unaddressed for longer periods. The Nihilus was a harder place to maintain Imperial control than the Imperium Sanctus on Terra's side of the rift. Commander Dante of the Blood Angels was eventually named Regent of the Nihilus, the supreme imperial authority for the dark half of the Imperium, carrying the responsibility of coordinating what could be coordinated across a region that was fundamentally resistant to centralized coordination. The oldest living space marine, the Lord of Baal, given charge of the half a galaxy where the light did not reach. The Imperium Sanctus. The half of the Imperium that retained reliable contact with Terra was the Imperium Sanctus. This was not the easy half. The gathering storm had produced crises across the Sanctus as well, and the rift's edge created its own challenges for worlds near the boundary. But the Sanctus had the Astronomicon, had the Golden Throne's consistent guidance, had the ability to communicate and coordinate across its territory in the way that the Imperium's governance had always depended on. The Sanctus was where Guilliman's return would have the greatest immediate impact. The Primarch's authority and his ability to project that authority depended on the infrastructure that the Sanctus's connectivity provided. The Indomitus Crusade that he launched could operate from the Sanctus as a base, using the reliable communication and navigation that the Sanctus's Astronomicon coverage allowed to reach and address the crises that the Rift's formation had produced in the Sanctus's territory before pressing into the Nihilus. The Sanctus's relative stability compared to the Nihilus was real, but should not be overstated. The Great Rift had destabilized the entire Imperium, not just its dark half. The warp storms that the Rift's formation had intensified were not confined to the Nihilus. The Sanctus had its own warp weather disruptions, its own elevated demonic activity near the Rift's edge, its own populations of psychers experiencing the consequences of a warp that was more active and less predictable than it had been for 10,000 years. What the Rift meant for other factions. The Great Rift's formation was not a purely imperial catastrophe. Every major faction in the galaxy was affected by a permanent change to the galaxy's fundamental geography. The Eldar, the Craftworlders, whose connection to the warp through their infinity circuits made them acutely sensitive to changes in the warp's behavior. The Rift's formation disrupted the psychic stability that the Craftworlds depended on for their most sensitive operations. The Seer's ability to read the skein of fate, already unreliable due to the darkness that Slaaneş's presence cast over Eldar psychic perception, was further degraded by the Rift's interference. Craftworlds near the Rift were in some cases forced to alter their navigational routes in ways that disrupted the long-planned paths they had been following. The Dark Elder, the inhabitants of Comora, the city in the Webway, had always relied on the Webway's stable connections to real space for their raids. The Rift's formation disrupted sections of the Webway in ways that required rerouting and created new vulnerabilities. Unexpected demonic incursions through the disrupted Webway sections into Comora itself were a consequence that the Dark Elder's leadership had not anticipated. The Necrons, the ancient civilization that was awakening from its great sleep across the galaxy, had the most long-term perspective on what the Rift represented. The Necrons had built the Pylon network millions of years ago to suppress the warp. The Rift's formation was the failure of a system they had constructed when humanity was still in caves. From the Necron perspective, the Rift was an engineering problem of existential scale. The same instinct that had led Trazyn to cooperate with Fall at Cadia was operating at a higher level across the Necron dynasties that were sufficiently awakened to assess the situation. The Silent King's return was connected to this assessment. Zarek had been in the intergalactic void for 60 million years. observing what the Tyranids had done to other galaxies, understanding the scale of the biological threat to material existence. His return to the Milky Way was partly a response to the Tyranid threat and partly a response to the warp's expansion. The Necron's restoration dream required a galaxy that could support organic life, and the rift threatened that support in ways that the Silent King had the long view to fully appreciate. The Tau, the younger species, whose psychic sensitivity was minimal and whose warp presence was accordingly reduced, were paradoxically somewhat insulated from the rift's most immediate psychic consequences. Their challenge was navigational and military. The disruption to void travel and the heightened chaos activity near the rift created problems for a civilization that was expanding through the regions affected by the Great Rift's edge, the Astronomicon and the Golden Throne. The event that the rift's formation created for terror above all, for the Golden Throne and the Emperor who sustained it, was not immediately apparent in the public narrative, but the strain that the rift placed on the Emperor's functions was real. The Astronomicon, which the Emperor maintained through the sacrifice of psychers fed to the Golden Throne, now had to operate in conditions that the rift had complicated. The signal was there. It was reaching the Sanctus reliably. Whether it was reaching the Nihilus reliably was the central question for navigation in the Dark Half, and the answer was not consistently yes. The Golden Throne itself was deteriorating. The machines that sustained the Emperor's non-life, built by the Dark Age of technology and sustained across 10,000 years with increasing difficulty by the Adeptus Mechanicus, was failing. The components that needed replacement could not be fully replicated. The engineering required to maintain it was pushing against the limits of what the Mechanicus understood. Kull's project, the one he had been working on for 10,000 years under the Emperor's original commission, had partly been about the throne's maintenance alongside its other objectives. The rift's formation placed additional stress on the throne systems. The warp's increased activity near Terra, not at the level of the rift itself, but the general elevation of the warp's turbulence that the rift's formation had produced across the galaxy, required more from the Emperor, demanded more of the Golden Throne, accelerated the deterioration that had already been ongoing. The Imperium had been running on borrowed time since the Horus Heresy. The Great Rift's formation updated the clock in a direction that made the remaining time shorter. Sleep well. 4 more parts remain, and the gathering storm is not finished. Cadia's fall was not a discrete event with a clear endpoint. It was the initiating catastrophe of a cascade, a sequence of events that flowed from the Pylon network's destruction and the Great Rift's formation, each one altering the galaxy's situation in ways that the next event then acted on. The period that the narrative designated the gathering storm was this cascade, the months and years of 999.M41 and the early years of M42, when the galaxy was being remade by what the 13th Black Crusade had set in motion. The gathering storm involved 3 narrative threads happening simultaneously or in close sequence. The Fall of Cadia and the formation of the Great Rift, which we have already followed. The events on Ultramar and Macraga that produced the awakening of Guilliman, and the events involving the Inari and the Eldar that produced new developments in the race against chaos. These threads were connected. The characters and forces involved moved between them. Their outcomes depended on each other, and the galaxy that emerged from the gathering storm was the product of all 3. Tonight we follow what came after Cadia, the events that the Rift's formation and Cadia's destruction set in motion, and the figures who navigated the catastrophe toward outcomes that were not simply the Imperium's collapse, the Saint and her crusade. Among the Imperial forces that had gathered at Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade was Saint Celestine, the living saint, the figure whose resurrection and battlefield manifestation had been documented across Imperial history, whose return from apparent death in the middle of battle had been attributed to the Emperor's direct intervention more times than standard theological accounts could easily explain, was present at Cadia and survived its fall. Celestine's nature was one of the Imperium's most carefully unexamined theological questions. She died in battle. She came back. The evidence of the Emperor's continued will acting through a mortal instrument was either genuinely present in her case, or the Imperium's institutional framework was attributing to divine will what was in fact something else. The involvement of a power operating at the same level as the Chaos Gods, but aligned against them. Potentially the Emperor's own psychic presence expressed through the avatar of a particularly beloved saint. She led the surviving Imperial forces through the evacuation of Cadia. Her presence, the golden radiance, the battlefield inspiration that her manifestation produced in the soldiers around her, was one of the factors that kept the evacuation from disintegrating into a rout. She was the kind of figure that made people capable of doing things they would not have been capable of without her presence, and what the Cadian survivors needed was the capability to fight their way off a planet that was being consumed by the warp. After Cadia's fall, Celestine became one of the central figures of what followed. The path that she helped navigate through the events of the Gathering Storm toward Macragge and Guilliman's awakening required the kind of inspired action under impossible conditions that her presence made possible. She did not plan the Gathering Storm's resolution. She embodied the faith and the capability that made the people around her able to execute whatever plan existed. The Gemini, Superior, the two former sisters of battle, whose spirits Celestine had brought back with her from one of her resurrections, who flanked her as bodyguards and whose own capabilities were enhanced by their connection to the living saint's manifestation. These were the companions who accompanied her through the Gathering Storm's events. They were evidence of the scale at which Celestine's power operated. She had not simply returned herself from death, she had brought others with her. The Inari and the Eldar thread. Simultaneously with the events on Cadia, a development within the Eldar civilization was approaching its own culmination. The Inari, the followers of Iniad, the Eldar god of the dead, whose awakening had been building across the 41st millennium, were involved in events on craftworld Biltan that connected to the Gathering Storm's broader narrative. Yvraine, the first daughter of Shaimesh and the emissary of Iniad, had been central to the awakening of the Eldar death god, or to the beginning of that awakening, since Iniad's full manifestation was an event whose scale exceeded anything that had happened yet. Her role was to gather the 5 Chronezords, the artifacts associated with Iniad's power, whose assembly would facilitate the god's awakening and potentially provide the Eldar with a weapon against Slaanesh. The events on Biltan, the shattering of the craft world in the context of the Gathering Storm's psychic upheaval, produced both destruction and something new. The Inari, who emerged from Biltan's shattering, were a new faction, combining Dark Eldar, Harlequins, and Craftworlders under the banner of the Death God's awakening path, pursuing the Crone Swords against the backdrop of a galaxy in the midst of the Gathering Storm's chaos. Their connection to the Gathering Storm's main narrative. Yvraine and the Inari eventually made contact with the forces gathering around Guilliman's awakening. The Eldar's long view. Their seers had been tracking the possibilities that the rift's formation created, identified the return of a Primarch as a development that could affect the balance of the galaxy's powers. The Ynnari and their objectives aligned with the Imperial forces' objectives around Macragge in ways that made cooperation possible, at least temporarily. The Eldar thread was the Gathering Storm's reminder that the galaxy's crises were not purely human problems. The rift's formation threatened every civilization that existed in real space. Alliances that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances became possible when the alternative was shared annihilation. Macragge and the sleeping Primarch, Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, the author of the Codex Astartes, the administrator and military genius who had been responsible for the second founding and the reorganization of the Space Marine legions into chapters, had been in stasis since the Horus Heresy's aftermath. His injury at the hands of Fulgrim during the fighting that had preceded the Siege of Terra, the poisoned blade that had taken centuries to kill him, that had left him in a state between death and life, preserved in a stasis field at the heart of Macragge's holiest shrine, had been a fact of the Imperium's existence for 10,000 years. The Lord of Macragge, the defender of Ultramar, the greatest living military mind the Imperium had ever produced, present but unreachable, existing in the amber of stasis while the galaxy changed around him. The events that led to his awakening were connected to the Gathering Storm's broader narrative. Magnus the Red's assault on the Fenris system, the Thousand Suns campaign that had been partly about testing new capabilities and partly about accessing something in the Space Wolves' archives, had produced warp storm disruptions that resonated through the warp in ways that the other events of the Gathering Storm amplified. The gathering of forces around Macragge. The rift's formation had produced disruptions near Ultramar that required response. The Ultramarines themselves, the chapter that carried Guilliman's most direct institutional legacy, the 500 worlds of Ultramar that he had built, were mounting their defense of their home system, while simultaneously some among them were advocating for the possibility that Guilliman could be restored. Call's role here was central. The Archmagos Dominus, who had survived Cadia's fall, had not been present at Cadia by accident. He had been travelling to the system as part of his 10,000-year project, carrying the fruits of centuries of preparation. Among those fruits was the work he had done on understanding the Primarch-grade biology that the stasis field had preserved. He believed Guilliman could be healed. He had developed the means to attempt it. The combination of Call's technical capability, the psychic intervention of Ivrain channeling Inyad's power, and the direct attention of forces operating at the highest available levels produced what had seemed impossible for 10,000 years. Guilliman's eyes opened. The Primarch wakes. The awakening of Roboute Guilliman is one of the most significant events in Warhammer 40,000's recent narrative history. Significant in the setting's in-universe terms, and in the meta-narrative terms of what it represented for the game's development. For 10,000 years, the Primarchs had been the absent fathers of the Space Marine chapters, figures of legend, the mythological first generation, whose names the chapters carried as their inherited identity, but who were not present in the contemporary galaxy. The traitor Primarchs in the Eye were alive, in various states of demonic enhancement or corruption, but not present in the Imperium's regular military operations. The loyal Primarchs were dead, missing, or sealed in states that prevented their active participation. The Primarch-shaped hole at the center of the Imperium's mythology was a defining feature of the setting. Guilliman's awakening broke this pattern. A loyal Primarch, walking the galaxy again, 10,000 years after the Horus heresy. The implications were enormous. His first experience of the Imperium he had helped build was disorienting in ways that the lore documents with care. He had helped design the Imperium as a rational, secular, scientifically grounded civilization, an extension of the Emperor's Great Crusade project of reclaiming humanity's galactic inheritance and building something lasting. What he found instead was the Ecclesiarchy's theocracy, the Ministerum's worship of the Emperor as a god, the institutional religiosity that had grown up in the 10,000 years of his absence. He was horrified. The law preserves his response to the Imperium he had helped found, having become something that he found morally and administratively catastrophic. A civilization that had embraced the superstition and the institutionalized oppression that the Emperor's project had been intended to overcome. What we have made the accounts attribute to him is a horror. He was also immediately necessary. The galaxy was in crisis. The gathering storm was active. The rift had formed. The Imperium needed what Guilliman was: military genius, administrative capability, the moral authority of a Primarch's name and presence. And it needed it now, regardless of what he thought about what the Imperium had become in his absence. He took command. The disorientation and the horror did not prevent the function. He assessed the situation, identified what needed to be done, and began doing it with the efficiency that 10,000 years of legend had promised, and that his presence confirmed. The Indomitus Crusade. Guilliman launched the Indomitus Crusade from Terra, after being recognized as Lord Commander of the Imperium. The role that the Imperial Regents had been filling in his absence now returned to the Primarch for whom it had originally been created. He organized the largest military operation the Imperium had mounted since the Great Crusade itself. The Indomitus Crusade was designed around Call's Primaris Space Marines, the new generation of Astartes that Call had been developing under the Emperor's commission, enhanced beyond the standard Space Marine template, produced in vast numbers, representing a reinvestment in the Space Marine program at a scale that the 10,000-year-old chapters had never been able to achieve, with the Crusade's military backbone. The Crusade moved through the Imperium Sanctus first, addressing the crises that the Gathering Storms events had produced in the half of the Imperium that the Astronomicon still reliably reached. It then pressed into the Nearless, through the rift, into the dark half, carrying the Primaris reinforcements to the chapters that had been isolated there, addressing the emergencies that the Nearless's reduced Imperial presence had allowed to develop. Guilliman at Baal, the Blood Angel's homeworld, which had been under assault from Hive Fleet Leviathan's tendril at the same time that the rift was forming, that had been defending itself with its successor chapters assembled in the largest gathering of Sanguinius's gene-seed sons in the chapter's history, was reached by the Crusade in time to turn what had been a desperate last stand into a victory. The simultaneous impact of the Great Rift's disruption on the Tyranid hive mind's coordination, combined with the Crusade's arrival, produced an outcome that Baal's defenders had not been able to achieve alone. The world that had been on the edge of falling to the Tyranids survived. Dante received the Primaris reinforcements that would allow the Blood Angels and their successors to continue operating despite their losses. And Dante was given the role of regent of the Nihilus, the authority that gave the oldest Space Marine living the responsibility for the dark half of the galaxy. Sleep well. 3 more parts remain, and Abaddon has not stopped moving. Abaddon had won. This is the statement that the Warhammer 40,000 narrative had avoided for 30 years of publication. The acknowledgement that the setting's most persistent antagonist had finally succeeded at the thing he had been attempting since before anyone currently playing the game was born. 12 Black Crusades had produced incremental progress toward the goal. The 13th had achieved it. Cadia was gone. The pylon network was destroyed. The Great Rift had formed. The galaxy had been permanently changed by the execution of a plan 10,000 years in the making. The conventional narrative around Abaddon had always emphasized failure. The mockery in the community around Abaddon, the armless Chaos Lord who kept launching crusades that came to nothing. The mockery missed what the lore had been documenting all along, that the apparent failures were the scaffolding of an eventual success, that each crusade had accomplished its pylon reduction objective even as it was stopped in its military ambitions, that the patience to run a plan across 10 millennia was the most dangerous quality any being in the setting could possess. The success was real. The question was what Abaddon did with it. The despoiler in the Dark Imperium. Abaddon had not exhausted his ambitions at Cadia. The destruction of the pylon network and the formation of the Great Rift were the preconditions he had been building toward, but they were preconditions for something further, rather than endpoints in themselves. The rift had opened a corridor, not the Cadian Gate, which no longer existed in its old form, but a broader destabilization that gave Chaos forces greater freedom of movement across the galaxy than they had possessed since before the Horus Heresy. He pressed through the opening. The forces that had constituted the 13th Black Crusade dispersed into the galaxy's changed geography, some moving deeper into the Imperium, some establishing presences on worlds that the Rift's disruption had left without adequate defense, some pursuing the individual agendas of Chaos Lords and Demon Princes, who had committed to the Crusade for their own reasons and who now saw opportunity in the chaos that the Rift had produced. Abaddon himself moved toward the vengeful spirit. The flagship of the Black Fleet, the vessel that bore the name of Horus's own flagship, the ship that the heresy had been conducted from, whose name Abaddon had maintained as a statement of succession and heritage, was the platform from which he organized the next phase. The Eye of Terror's expansion had changed his strategic position in ways that were not all favorable. The Chaos forces that had been based in the Eye now had a larger territory to operate from. The Rift had effectively extended the Eye-adjacent zone across a much wider arc of the galaxy. But larger territory meant less concentrated force, and the Rift's disruption affected Chaos forces as well as Imperial ones. Demon armies that had operated with relative freedom within the Eye found the Rift's altered warp geography produced different conditions than they had been accustomed to. The Crimson Path had been achieved. The follow-on objectives required different planning. What the traitor legions did. The traitor legions that had participated in the 13th Black Crusade dispersed with purposes of their own in the Rift's aftermath. Each legion, or each warband, since the legions had fragmented significantly across 10,000 years, had objectives that the Gathering Storm's events had either opened up or complicated. The Thousand Suns and Magnus. Magnus the Red had been involved in events around Fenris and around Macraga in the same period as the 13th Black Crusade. The Thousand Suns campaigns had been contributing to the simultaneous crises that fed the Rift's formation. In the Dark Imperium's early phase, the planet of the sorcerers had been moved. Magnus had used his psychic power to physically relocate the Thousand Suns' homeworld into the space adjacent to the Fenris system, an act of territorial aggression and a demonstration of what a demon Primarch operating at full capability could accomplish. The implications of a demon Primarch's fortress world repositioning itself next to the Space Wolves' home system were not subtle. Magnus was declaring that the war with the Space Wolves, the conflict that had begun with Prospero, that had been building across the millennia, was entering a new phase with new stakes. The Space Wolves would have to address the presence of the planet of the sorcerers in their system, or accept that their home was now permanently menaced by their ancient enemy, the Death Guard and Mortarion. The Death Guard, led by their demon Primarch Mortarion, turned their attention to Ultramar. The Garden Worlds of Guilliman's domain, the 500 worlds that the Ultramarines had developed into the Imperium's most prosperous and best governed region, were exactly what the Death Guard's philosophy of decay and entropy found most offensive. Healthy, ordered, productive, connected. Everything that Nurgle's gifts unmade. The plague campaigns that the Death Guard unleashed on Ultramar were among the most devastating military operations of the Dark Imperium's early period. Guilliman had to fight for his home system. The Primarch, who had just returned from 10,000 years of stasis, who had been managing the Indomitus Crusade and trying to hold the galaxy together, found himself in a direct confrontation with his corrupted brother over the worlds he had built. The duel between the two Primarchs, Guilliman and Mortarion, was one of the defining engagements of the Dark Imperium's early narrative. Two brothers who had not faced each other since the heresy meeting again, across the ruins of what the heresy had made of both of them. The Cadian diaspora at war. The Cadian soldiers who had evacuated from their dying world did not stop fighting. They had nowhere to return to. The homeworld was gone. The fortress was rubble and warp-touched debris. But the military tradition they carried was intact, and the galaxy they were now part of needed what that tradition represented. Cadian regiments deployed across the Imperium's most active fronts in the Dark Imperium's early phase. The soldiers who had been the model of Imperial Guard excellence for 10,000 years were now the most experienced large-scale void evacuation survivors in recent Imperial history. People who had fought through the 13th Black Crusade's full intensity, who had seen Cadia fall, who carried the weight of watching their world die and the determination to make that death mean something. Cadia stands. The phrase that had been born in the evacuation ships had become a rallying point. Cadian regiments on other worlds' battlefields used it the way a prayer is used. Not as a description of geographical fact, since Cadia no longer stood in any geographical sense, but as a statement of identity. We are the people who stood at Cadia. We are still standing. We stand here now on this ground, and what we are is what Cadia was. The Cadian officer corps who had survived, the commanders and sergeants and specialists whose institutional knowledge made them disproportionately valuable beyond their individual fighting capability, were distributed across the formations that had taken them in after the evacuation. Some stayed together, maintaining Cadian regimental designations in newly recruited formations. Others were integrated into mixed formations, their expertise and their particular quality of military culture spreading into units that had not been Cadian, but had absorbed enough Cadians to carry some of the tradition. The physical world was gone. The tradition was not. The pylons and what was lost. The full implications of the pylon network's destruction only became clear in the years after Cadia's fall, as the galactic geography that the pylons had maintained became visibly altered. The Eye of Terror's expansion had been the most immediate consequence, but the pylons had also been doing something subtler across the broader galaxy that their destruction revealed by its absence. the stability of warp travel, the relatively predictable nature of void journeys across the galaxy, had been partly a function of the pylon network's suppression of the warp's turbulence. Without the pylons, the warp became less predictable. Ships that had been able to travel between points in established timeframes found those timeframes no longer reliable. The navigation that the Imperium's entire logistics and communication infrastructure depended on became more uncertain. This uncertainty wasn't catastrophic in the way that the Eye's expansion was catastrophic. It was incremental, a degradation of reliability rather than a sudden failure. But across the galaxy, across millions of ships making millions of journeys, the cumulative effect of slightly less reliable warp travel produced significant disruptions to the systems that depended on it: supply chains, reinforcement routes, diplomatic communications, the infrastructure of a galactic civilization built around warp travel as its primary medium of connection. The Adeptus Mechanicus's analysis of what had been lost was grimly comprehensive. The pylons could not be rebuilt. The Blackstone they were made of was not something that the Mechanicus could manufacture. It was a Necron material whose production processes the Mechanicus had never been able to replicate. The Necron dynasties that had built the original network had not offered to rebuild it, and the Silent King's Nexus arrangement, the coalition that Zarek had been building to address the Tyranid threat, was focused on biological rather than warp threats in its primary objectives. Call had preserved knowledge of how the pylons worked. His decades of study meant that the understanding existed, even though the means of replication did not. Whether that understanding could ever be translated into action, whether the Necrons could be persuaded to rebuild what had been destroyed, whether another material could be found with sufficient warp suppression properties, whether the pylon's function could be approximated through other means, were questions that the Dark Imperium's early period had not answered. Trazin's collection. The Necron Lord who had cooperated with the Imperial forces at Cadia had left with something: his method of preserving significant individuals in stasis, the prison dimension that housed historical figures and artifacts from across the galaxy's history, had gained creed. Trazin's relationship to what he collected was one of the Warhammer 40,000 universe's more darkly comedic threads. He was not malicious in the conventional sense. His collection was not about causing suffering, but about preserving things he found interesting. The collection had Celestinian Imperial Guard officers from ancient campaigns. It had significant figures from across the galaxy's history, preserved in the moment of their collection, existing in suspension while time moved on outside. It was, from the collector's perspective, a library. From the perspective of the collected, it was imprisonment. Creed was added to this library, whether the Lord Castellan was aware of being collected, whether the stasis preservation maintained consciousness or simply preserved the body, was one of the questions that the law held without resolution. From Creed's perspective, if he had any perspective in the stasis field, the moment of Cadia's final collapse had been immediately followed by whatever Trazin's collection meant experientially. From the galaxy's perspective, one of the most capable military commanders alive had been removed from the active roster and placed in a Necron's trophy cabinet. Whether he would ever be retrieved, whether the collection would ever be opened in circumstances that allowed Creed to be returned to active service, the Dark Imperium's narrative had not resolved this at the time of the event's documentation. The irony of Trazyn the Infinite's collection preserving the man who had commanded Cadia's last stand was not lost on those who knew about it. The Necron who had helped try to save Cadia had also taken its defender as a souvenir of the effort. The Vigilus system. The Vigilus system became one of the Dark Imperium's most critical strategic points, precisely because of Cadia's fall and the Great Rift's formation. Sitting on one of the few reliable void routes between the Imperium Sanctus and the Nihilus, a corridor through the rift that ships could navigate without the full uncertainty that the rift's main body imposed. Vigilus was the connection point that made the Imperium's two halves anything other than completely separated. Abaddon identified this. The Vigilus War, the campaign that the narrative's Dark Imperium phase built toward, was Abaddon's attempt to close the one reliable connection between the Imperium's two halves. If Vigilus fell, the Nihilus would be effectively severed from Terra, and the already difficult situation of the Dark Half would become something closer to the total isolation that complete separation would produce. The Vigilus War involved all the major factions of the Dark Imperium, Space Marine chapters, Chaos forces, Orc war bands drawn to the fighting by the War energy building in the system, Genestealer cults that had been seeded into Vigilus's population across years of preparation. Guilliman himself was drawn into the Vigilus conflict. The Primarch's attention pulled from the Indomitus Crusade to the strategic point that Abaddon was threatening. The Vigilus War was where Abaddon and Guilliman came closest to direct confrontation, the two figures who most embodied the conflict between the Imperium and Chaos, the War Master of the Dark Gods and the returned Primarch, on the same world at the same time, with the fate of the connection between the Imperium's two halves as the strategic context. Sleep well. Two more parts remain, and the question of what Cadia's fall means is still ahead. History is made by events, but it is experienced through people. The fall of Cadia was a catastrophe of galactic scale. A world destroyed, a pylon network annihilated, a galaxy permanently scarred by the rift that followed. The numbers involved were incomprehensible. Hundreds of millions of defenders, billions of civilians, fleets of warships, demon armies beyond counting. The scale of it resists the kind of understanding that matters to the people living through it. What the people living through it experienced was the persons around them. The commanders who gave the orders, the saints who appeared when hope was failing, the soldiers who held the line because the person next to them was holding it, the Necron Lord who arrived at the worst possible moment and offered something unexpected, the old man in the Terminator armor who appeared in place of 1,000 dead warriors he carried in his collection. Tonight we follow the people of Cadia's last stand. Not the events in sequence, but the figures who shaped them, whose characters and choices and capabilities made the fall what it was, rather than simply what it had to be. Ursarker E. Creed, the soldier who held the council together. We have followed Creed's role in the campaign already. The assumption of command after the High Command massacre, the extraordinary coordination he provided to the coalition of Imperial forces, Kull and Trazyn, the management of a military situation that should have been hopeless through sheer professional capability and strategic clarity. What deserves more attention is the person rather than the function. Creed was Acadian. This was not simply a biographical fact. It was the totality of his identity in the way that being Cadian was the totality of most Cadians' identities. He had been born into the military culture, trained from childhood, shaped by an environment whose entire purpose was the defense of a single strategic point. He had risen through the ranks of an institution that had been producing excellent soldiers for 10,000 years and had been assessed by that institution's own exacting standards as exceptional. He had spent his career preparing for the event that was now happening. The 13th Black Crusade was not a surprise for Creed. It was the event that every Cadian who understood the situation had known was coming. The pattern of the Black Crusades, the reduction of the pylons over 12 campaigns, the building pressure on the eye. These were things that the Cadian military institution had been tracking, and Creed had been tracking them more carefully than most. The tactical genius quality that the game statistics associated with his in-universe representation captured something real. He had an ability to see the full picture of a military situation with a clarity that exceeded what his intelligence and experience alone would have predicted. He deployed this ability consistently throughout the 13th Crusade, finding the formations that created positions stronger than their component parts, identifying the moments when offensive action could disrupt chaos, advances more effectively than continued defense, managing the arrival of reinforcements with a precision that extracted maximum value from each addition. He was also capable of the decisions that tactical genius sometimes required, the ones that looked wrong by conventional analysis and were right anyway. Accepting Trajan's cooperation was one of these. The Inquisition's recommendation to virus bomb Cadia was a conventional response to a situation where the world's fall seemed inevitable, and denying its resources to chaos seemed like the only remaining option. Creed rejected it. He was working with a Necron lord and attempting to amplify an ancient alien network to push back a demonic incursion. This was not the manual's recommended approach. It was the right approach for the situation. He was taken by Trajan at the end. Whether this was rescue or collection is a question that says more about Trajan's nature than about Creed's. From Creed's perspective, if he had any perspective in the stasis field, the last moment of Cadia's defense was also his last moment of anything knowable. The man who had commanded the last stand of humanity's most celebrated fortress world was removed from the battlefield in the act of a being who found him interesting enough to preserve. His fate remained unresolved. The Lord Castellan was in Trajan's collection, and the law held open the question of whether he would ever emerge from it. San Celestine, the living miracle. The theological debate about Celestine had been running for as long as she had been appearing on battlefields. Was she genuinely the Emperor's avatar, a manifestation of his continued will acting through a mortal vessel? Was she something else, a powerful psychic phenomenon, or the product of an unacknowledged power operating in the galaxy's spiritual ecosystem? Was she simply a very resilient warrior whose resurrections had natural explanations that the ecclesiarchy had chosen not to pursue too carefully? The debate was somewhat academic in the context of the 13th Black Crusade. Whatever she was, she functioned. The living saint who appeared on Cadia's most desperate front lines, who rallied defenders who had given up, who died and came back and died again and came back again. She was doing the thing that the Imperium's faith needed someone to do. People fought harder near her. They found capabilities they did not know they had. The miracle of her presence was real in its effects regardless of its ultimate explanation. She had a history of appearing at the most critical moments of the most desperate battles, and the 13th Black Crusade was exactly the kind of situation that history predicted she would appear at. She did. She fought. She survived the destruction of Cadia. She continued. What Celestine represented beyond her individual capability was the possibility that the Emperor's will was still present in the galaxy, that the being on the Golden Throne, who could not act directly, who existed in a state between death and life that prevented direct intervention, was nevertheless exerting some influence through instruments like her. The faith that the Imperium's billions of ordinary citizens maintained was not simply institutional inertia. It was connected to something that was making itself felt at the moments when the Imperium most needed it. She went on. The Gathering Storm's events required her presence at multiple points, and she moved between them with the quality of someone whose purpose extended beyond any single battlefield. The saint who had rallied Cadia's defenders was the same figure who would eventually stand at Macragge when Guilliman awoke. She was a thread connecting the Gathering Storm's events into something that had coherence beyond the sum of its crises. Belisarius Cawl, the man who had been working for 10,000 years. Carl's relationship to time was unusual, even by the standards of a very long-lived Archmagos. He had been active, continuously, since the Emperor's commission in the immediate aftermath of the heresy. 10,000 years of unbroken project development, across a period that had seen the entire civilization he served transform beyond recognition. He was older than the Codex Astartes. He was older than the Ecclesiarchy. He was older than virtually every institution in the contemporary Imperium. He had been there before them and had watched them grow up, and he remembered what the Imperium had been before it became what it was. This gave him a perspective on the Gathering Storm's events that no one else present could share. He understood what had been lost, not just in the immediate sense of Cadia's fall and the Pylon network's destruction, but in the longer sense of what the Imperium had been trying to do when it was still trying to do what the Emperor had intended. He had been part of that attempt. He was still part of it, in his own way, with his own projects. His cooperation with Trajan at Cadia was not a compromise of his principles. It was the application of them, the recognition that the pylons were the priority, that activating them required Necron knowledge that Cawl's own millennia of study had not fully provided, and that letting the ideal be the enemy of the achievable would produce a worse outcome than accepting an uncomfortable alliance. He had been working long enough to understand that perfect solutions were rare, and that workable ones required flexibility. His projects continued after Cadia. The Primaris Space Marines had been deployed. The 10,000-year project of Enhanced Astartes was out in the world, changing the character of the Space Marine chapters, raising questions about identity and continuity that the chapters themselves would need to work through. The Phalanx had survived the engagement with the will of eternity, damaged but functional. The institutional knowledge about the pylons was preserved in Cawl, even if the pylons themselves were gone. He had lost things at Cadia that could not be recovered. The pylon network was the most significant. The 10,000 years of study that had taught him how to amplify a system that no longer existed. The world whose people had been the Imperium's model of military excellence. What remained was the knowledge and the projects and the enormous, continuous, functional mind that had been working on the Emperor's problems since before most of the Imperium's current institutions were born. Trajan the Infinite, the unexpected ally. The Necron Collector who had appeared at Cadia was not a character who fit any of the conventional frameworks for understanding the events he participated in. He was not an ally in the full sense. His objectives were his own. His cooperation was conditional on those objectives aligning with the Imperial Forces' objectives, and his final act at Cadia demonstrated that his priorities included his collection, regardless of the implications for the people being collected. His cooperation with Cawl was genuine in its context. The Necron who had built the pylons, or whose civilization had, understanding them in ways that Cawl's millennia of study had approached but not reached, was a resource that the situation required. Whatever Trajan's long-term objectives were, the immediate objective of preventing the Eye of Terror from expanding aligned with the Necron dynasty's broader interests in a materially grounded galaxy. He helped. The help was real. His collection was also real. The prison dimension that he maintained, the stasis preserved historical figures and artifacts from across the galaxy's history, had gained Creed, and possibly others from the Cadian evacuation. The collector, who had helped defend Cadia, had also taken pieces of the defense as trophies. This was Trazyn, the figure whose complexity defied simple characterization. Neither fully villain nor fully ally, operating according to a value system that was his own and that intersected with other factions' values only at the points where their objectives happened to align. His presence at Cadia was one of the Gathering Storm's more unexpected elements, and his role in the events there, the amplification, cooperation, the collection of significant individuals, reflected both the possibilities and the costs of dealing with a being of his nature. He remained active after Cadia. The Necron who had preserved aspects of the Last Stand in his collection was still out in the galaxy, still collecting, still operating according to the long view of a being who had been conscious since before humanity was a spacefaring species. Thus, the Cadian soldiers themselves. The most numerous figures of the Last Stand were the ones whose names the law did not preserve. The individual shock troopers and Kasrkin and armoured column crews and artillery batteries who had manned the Cassars and held the lines and died in the 13th Black Crusade's ground campaign. The people who had been born into the military culture, who had spent their lives training for this, who were present on the surface when the will of eternity fell, and who did not make it to the evacuation ships. They had been doing what Cadians had been doing for 10,000 years, standing in the path of the worst thing the eye of terror could send, dying when necessary, in a way that cost the enemy more than it would have cost any other force, making Cadia's fall as expensive as it was possible to make it. The Cadian gene pool had been shaped by this for 10,000 years, the culture that produced soldiers who would hold a position beyond what pure calculation of survival would suggest. That made standing the default response to overwhelming force rather than retreating, was the product of a civilization that had been selected by its situation for exactly these qualities. The ordinary Cadian soldier was extraordinary in the way that any person shaped entirely by a demanding environment for a demanding purpose can be extraordinary. They were gone. Most of them. The ones who survived were a fraction of the population that had existed on Cadia, and they carried the identity of a world that had ceased to exist. The soldiers who continued to fight under the Cadian name in the Dark Imperium were carrying something that the dead had given them. The tradition, the doctrine, the quality of will that 10,000 years of standing had produced. Cadia stands in them, in the regiments that formed around their survivors, in the institutions that had been built from their model. The world was rubble, but what the world had been for was not. Sleep well. One final part remains, and the question of what Cadia's fall means is still waiting. Let everything slow. We have followed Cadia from the 10,000 years of its standing, the pylons, the gate, the soldiers born into the purpose of holding, through the 13th Black Crusade's build-up and the scale of what Abaddon assembled, through the kinetic strike and the pylons' destruction and the Great Rift's formation, through the Gathering Storm and Guilliman's awakening and the Indomitus Crusade, through the figures who made the stand what it was. Now we step back and ask what the story was doing, what Cadia was actually about. The surface reading of Cadia's story is straightforward. A fortress world that held for 10,000 years was finally destroyed by a plan that had been building across all 10 of those millennia. The fortress fell. The galaxy changed. The story moved on. The deeper reading requires sitting with what Cadia represented before it fell. What the world meant to the Imperium, not simply as a strategic asset, but as an idea. Cadia was the argument that humanity could hold, against the worst the galaxy could assemble, against the Eye of Terror and the demon armies and the traitor legions and Abaddon's 10,000 years of planning. Humanity could build a world that stood. The argument had been validated 12 times across 10,000 years, 12 Black Crusades. 12 times the answer had been yes. Humanity can hold. The gate can be defended. The line can be maintained. The 13th was the first number. The number mattered differently from how a simple military defeat would have mattered. Military defeats were common in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The galaxy was full of them, worlds taken and retaken, front lines advancing and retreating across the same ground for centuries. What made Cadia's fall different was the permanence. The pylons were not rebuilding. The world was not being recaptured. The gate was gone in the form it had existed. This was not a setback to be recovered from. It was a change. The question the change posed was whether the argument Cadia had been making was actually true, or whether it had simply been running long enough that it seemed true. Had humanity been able to hold because it was genuinely capable of holding, or because Abaddon had been choosing not to fully press his advantage while he prepared the prerequisite conditions? If the second was true, then the 10,000 years of standing had not been proof of humanity's capability to hold. It had been proof of Abaddon's patience. The Timor, the two readings of the fall. There is a reading of Cadia's fall that is purely tragic. The world that had stood since the Horus Heresy, that had been the Imperium's most enduring symbol of resistance, fell to a plan that had been building since before anyone currently defending it was born. The people who died on Cadia died defending something that was going to fall regardless of how well they fought. The tactical genius of Creed, the miraculous presence of Celestine, the unexpected cooperation of Trazyn, the amplification work of Call. None of it was enough, because the pylons were destroyed by the kinetic impact and the Great Rift formed anyway. In this reading, Cadia's 10,000 years were the setup for a fall that Abaddon had always intended, and the fall was the real event. The standing was beautiful and meaningful and worthy of commemoration, but it was always going to end this way. The second reading is less comfortable and more interesting. Cadia's fall produced the Gathering Storm, which produced the conditions for Guilliman's awakening, which produced the Indomitus Crusade, which produced the Primaries Space Marines, which produced a reformed and reinvigorated Imperium that was demonstrably more capable of surviving the Dark Imperium's challenges than the pre-Cadia Imperium had been. The galaxy that existed after Cadia's fall was a harder place to live in than the galaxy before it, but the Imperium's response to the fall had produced capabilities that the pre-fall Imperium had not possessed. In this reading, Cadia's fall was the crisis that forced the transformation the Imperium needed, but would not have undertaken voluntarily. 10,000 years of the status quo had produced a civilization that was defending what it had, rather than building what it needed. The fall broke the status quo violently enough that what came after was genuinely different. Neither reading is wrong. Both are present in the narrative. The tragedy is real. The transformation is also real. Cadia's fall was both catastrophic loss and the initiating event of necessary change simultaneously, without either dimension cancelling the other. The phrase that survived, Cadia stands. The phrase became the most enduring legacy of the world's fall, more durable than any of the physical artifacts that survived the evacuation, more resilient than any of the institutional structures that carried Cadian tradition forward. 3 words that asserted something true in a way that defied the geographical fact of the world's destruction. Cadia stands because the people stand. The 10,000 years of soldiers who had held the gate had not been holding a piece of rock. They had been expressing something about what it meant to be human in a galaxy that was full of things that wanted to consume or corrupt or destroy humanity. The willingness to stand in the path of overwhelming force and hold, not because calculations said it was survivable, but because something required it. This was what Cadia meant. The phrase worked as a rallying cry, because it was true in the dimension that mattered. The physical world was gone. The dimension that mattered was not physical. It was the tradition, the identity, the quality of will that 10,000 years of standing had produced, and that survived the world's destruction in the people who had been shaped by it. Every Cadian regiment that deployed in the Dark Imperium with the name Cadian in its designation was a piece of evidence for the phrase's truth. The soldiers who had grown up on the world that no longer existed, carrying its institutional memory into new theatres, fighting with the quality of attention and determination that the world's culture had produced. They were Cadia standing. The recruits who would eventually join those regiments, young people from other worlds who had never seen Cadia, who had never breathed its air or walked its streets or manned its casas, who took the Cadian name and were shaped by the tradition it carried, were also Cadia standing. The tradition was transmissible in ways that the geographical world was not. A world was destroyed. The idea of the world persisted. The two were different things, and the fall of the world did not end the idea. What the pylons meant in the end. The Cadian pylons had been the world's most important secret and its most significant contribution to the galaxy's survival. 5,000 structures of ancient Necron Blackstone, standing for millions of years before Cadia was inhabited, doing the work of suppressing the Eye of Terror, without the people living next to them understanding what they were doing. Their destruction was the irreversible event of the 13th Black Crusade, the action that could not be undone, that the Gathering Storm's subsequent events could not address, that the Indomitus Crusade's reforms could not repair. Guilliman's return, the Primaris Marines, the reformed Imperium. None of these addressed the thing that had actually been lost. The Eye of Terror was larger than it had been before Cadia's fall. The Great Rift existed. The galaxy's navigational reliability had been degraded. The warp's pressure on real space was higher than at any point since the Horus Heresy. These were not temporary conditions to be resolved by a military campaign or a political reform, or even a Primarch's intervention. They were the new baseline. The galaxy the Imperium was defending in the Dark Imperium was a harder galaxy than the one Cadia had been defending. The work that the pylons had been doing, invisibly, for 10,000 years, was now visibly absent. The protective infrastructure that humanity had inherited from a civilization it had not built and barely understood was gone, and nothing was available to replace it. This is what the pylons being Necron built ultimately meant. The Imperium had been relying on technology it did not understand, maintaining infrastructure it could not replicate, enjoying protection whose source it had not investigated too carefully. When that protection was removed, the Imperium found itself in the position of someone who had been sheltering under someone else's roof without knowing whose roof it was, and who now had to weather the storm without it. Kor knew this better than anyone. The Archmagos, who had studied the pylons for decades, who understood what they had been doing and what their destruction meant, was the person most capable of articulating the full dimension of the loss. he was also one of the people least likely to despair about it. His project horizon was long enough that losses, even significant ones, were inputs to the ongoing work rather than conclusions. The Dark Imperium's first lesson. The galaxy that emerged from Cadia's fall was teaching the Imperium something it had been avoiding learning for 10,000 years. The lesson was about the relationship between the past and the present, about what it meant to be a civilization that had been defending what it had, rather than building what it needed. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had been maintaining the great structures of the heresy's aftermath, the Codex Astartes, the Ecclesiarchy, the High Lords of Terror, the systems of governance and military command and theological order that Guilliman had helped design, had been preserved and defended rather than developed. The assumption that what had been built after the heresy was sufficient for the galaxy's challenges had produced a civilization that was technically sophisticated in some areas and fossilized in others. Cadia's fall was the end of the maintaining phase. The maintained structures, the pylon network, the Cadian Gate, the navigational stability that the pylons had supported, were gone. What remained was the question of what to build next. Guilliman's horror at what the Imperium had become was the response of someone who had been present for the building and who now saw what the maintaining had produced. His work, the Indomitus Crusade, the Primaris Project, the administrative reforms he was trying to introduce, was an attempt to begin building again after 10,000 years of maintenance. Whether it was working was the question that the Dark Imperium's narrative was exploring. The Dark Imperium was harder. It was also, in some ways that were difficult to hold alongside the horror, more honest. The comfortable illusion that the eye could be contained indefinitely, that the status quo was sustainable, that what had been built after the heresy was adequate for the galaxy's challenges. That illusion had been shattered along with the pylons. What came after had to be built without it. One final image. The debris field where Cadia had been. The rubble of a world that had stood for 10,000 years, orbiting the space where the Cadian Gate had been the narrowest point between the Eye of Terror and the Imperium's populated worlds. The gate was not there anymore. The rift had made it irrelevant as a navigational concept. The passage that had been the gate was now the edge of a permanent tear in reality, and ships did not navigate it the way they had navigated it when Cadia stood. The strategic geography had changed completely. Among the rubble, some of the Blackstone of the destroyed pylons still existed. Fragments of the structures that had been holding the eye back for millions of years, now scattered across the debris field, along with everything else that Cadia's destruction had produced. The material that the Adeptus Mechanicus could not replicate, that had been part of the protective infrastructure humanity had relied on without understanding, lying in pieces among the ruins of the world that had stood next to it. The Eye of Terror was larger than it had been. The Great Rift ran across the galaxy. The Imperium was split, and the Astronomican's light was unreliable in the dark half, and the Golden Throne was deteriorating, and Abaddon had achieved the objective he had been building toward for 10,000 years. Cadia stood. For 10,000 years it stood, and when it fell in a way that the galaxy had never seen before, and what came after was shaped by every year of the standing and every moment of the fall simultaneously. 10,000 years of soldiers, 12 Black Crusades, one fortress world at the galaxy's most critical choke point, between the eye and everything else. It held until it didn't, and what it had held for was worth every year of the holding. This has been the entire Fall of Cadia timeline. From the ancient pylons and the world that grew up next to them, through 10,000 years of Black Crusades and the patient plan behind them, through the 13th Crusade and the kinetic strike and the Rift's formation, through the gathering storm and Gilliman's return and the Dark Imperium's first years, to the debris field, where a world that had stood for 10,000 years became the initiating event of everything that came after it, told slowly, over 8 nights, for the dark between waking and the eye's distant light. Cadia stands. Good night, my dear friend.